Thank you for providing these details. I'll create a realistic 4-chapter story about George's weight loss journey and heart disease reversal in the United States. The story will be written in English with approximately 1,100 words per chapter, focusing on authentic human drama without any supernatural elements. George lost 68 pounds and reversed his heart disease. Chapter 1. The morning light filtered through the Venetian blinds of Dr. Winter's office, casting zebra-like shadows across the polished oak desk where George Matthews sat, his 286-pound frame causing the leather chair to creak in protest. At 52, George's once imposing stature had morphed into something that felt foreign to him, a body that betrayed him with every labored breath, every flight of stairs that left him winded. "I'm not going to sugarcoat this, George," Dr. Winters said, sliding a manila folder across the desk. Her eyes, compassionate yet unflinching, met his. "Your cardiac stress test results are concerning. The blockage in your coronary arteries has progressed significantly since your last checkup. If we don't intervene now, we're looking at a major cardiac event, potentially fatal, within the next 12 to 18 months. George's throat constricted. The suburban Philadelphia life he'd built, the award-winning architectural firm, the colonial house with the wraparound porch in Bryn Mawr, the college funds for 16-year-old Emma and 14-year-old Tyler, suddenly seemed like a house of cards. "Options?" he managed to ask, his voice barely audible over the blood rushing in his ears. "Immediate medication for starters. But honestly, George, at this point, your lifestyle needs a complete overhaul. Your weight, diet, sedentary habits, they're all contributing factors. I'm recommending cardiac rehabilitation, nutritional counseling, and a monitored exercise program." George nodded mechanically, his mind already drifting to the McDonald's drive-thru where he'd stopped that morning, his third fast food breakfast that week. He thought about the desk drawer in his office, filled with candy bars, the evening ritual of ice cream while watching late-night television, the weekend pizza deliveries that had become a cornerstone of family time. The 30-minute drive home felt like a journey through a tunnel of noise. Radio advertisements for local diners, billboards for craft beer festivals, the familiar golden arches beckoning from every other exit. America's abundance suddenly looked different to George, not as freedom, but as a carefully constructed trap. When he pulled into his driveway, Sarah's car was already there. His wife of 21 years, a high school English teacher with a passion for gardening, had maintained her slender figure through the decades. They had drifted apart in recent years, their conversations reduced to logistical discussions about the kids' schedules and household maintenance. George couldn't remember the last time they had touched beyond an occasional brush of hands while passing the salt. He sat in the car for several minutes, rehearsing what to say. "How do you tell your family that you've been slowly killing yourself with every bite, that your choices might leave them alone?" The thought of Emma's graduation, Tyler's baseball games, Sarah's retirement, milestones he might miss, sent a wave of nausea through him. Inside, he found Sarah grading papers at the kitchen island, reading glasses perched on her nose, a cup of herbal tea steaming beside her. She looked up, and something in his expression must have alarmed her, because she immediately removed her glasses. "What is it?" she asked, her voice tinged with concern that reminded him of earlier days, when they still instinctively attuned to each other's emotions. George sank onto a bar stool, the news weighing on him like a physical burden. "Heart disease. Pretty advanced." The words hung in the air between them. "Dr. Winters says I need to make some major changes or—" He couldn't finish the sentence. Sarah's face paled, but there was something else in her expression, a flash of validation, as if a suspicion had been confirmed. "I've been worried about you for years, George. The way you eat, how you never exercise, how winded you get just playing with Rusty." Their golden retriever raised his head at the mention of his name, then resumed his nap in the corner. "I know," George admitted, shame burning his cheeks. "I just never thought it would catch up to me so soon." "What's the plan?" Sarah asked, and there was a new alertness in her posture, a readiness that reminded George of when they'd first bought their fixer-upper, how she'd rolled up her sleeves and tackled each renovation challenge with determination. Complete lifestyle overhaul, diet, exercise, stress management, the works. Sarah nodded, a decisive movement that spoke volumes. Then that's what we'll do, all of us. She reached across the island and placed her hand over his, the first intentional touch in months. You're not doing this alone, George. That evening, after a family dinner where George broke the news to Emma and Tyler, witnessing fear flash across his daughter's eyes and his son's sudden, uncharacteristic silence, he stood in front of the bathroom mirror. Shirtless, he forced himself to really look at what he'd become. The drooping flesh, the strain evident in his posture, the unhealthy pallor of his skin. Behind the physical deterioration, he saw something worse, a man who had resigned himself to slow decay, who had stopped fighting for his own life long before his heart had begun to fail. As he turned away from his reflection, his phone buzzed with a text from Emma. "Dad, I Googled heart-healthy recipes. Can we try some this weekend? Love you." The simplicity of the message, the unadorned declaration of love, broke something open inside George. Standing there in the harsh bathroom light, he made a silent promise, not just to lose weight or exercise more, but to reclaim his life, to become the father, husband, and man he had once intended to be. The road ahead would be grueling, but for the first time in years, the future contained something George had almost forgotten. Possibility. Urdani Chapter 2. 6 weeks into his transformation, George stood in the produce section of Whole Foods, a place that had once been as foreign to him as a distant country. Now he navigated the aisles with growing confidence, checking labels and filling his cart with colorful vegetables, lean proteins, and whole grains. His shopping list, meticulously prepared by Karen, his nutritionist from the cardiac rehabilitation program, was becoming less of a chore and more of a roadmap to freedom. "George Matthews, is that you?" a voice called from behind him as he deliberated between kale varieties. George turned to see Dave Simmons, a former client and occasional golf partner. Dave's eyes widened as he took in George's appearance. "Man, you're looking different. Everything okay?" Dave asked, a hint of concern in his voice. George realized that to the outside world, his rapid 20-pound weight loss might appear alarming rather than celebratory. "Actually, everything's getting better," he replied, and for the first time since his diagnosis, he found himself sharing his story without shame. "Heart disease diagnosis. I'm making some serious changes." Dave's expression shifted from concern to admiration. "That takes guts, George. My dad had 3 bypasses before he finally changed his habits. Too late, though. Complications got him 2 years later." There was a raw honesty in Dave's voice that created an unexpected moment of connection in the middle of the produce section. As they parted ways, George felt a curious lightness. The exchange with Dave had been brief, but significant. The first time he'd publicly acknowledged his journey. It reminded him of a principle from his architectural work. Transformation is never private. It always affects the surrounding space. Back home, George found Tyler in the kitchen, attempting to follow a recipe from a YouTube channel focused on healthy meal prep. The kitchen counter was cluttered with ingredients, and a light dusting of flour covered Tyler's Philadelphia Eagles t-shirt. "Dad, can you help me figure out how to cook quinoa? This stuff looks like birdseed," Tyler asked, holding up a measuring cup of the tiny grains. For a moment, George was transported back to Tyler's childhood, teaching him to ride a bike, helping with science projects, coaching his Little League team. Somewhere along the way, as Tyler entered adolescence and George retreated further into his work and food-centered coping mechanisms, they had lost that easy companionship. Now, ironically, George's health crisis was creating new bridges. "Let's figure it out together," George said, washing his hands at the sink. "I've never cooked it either." As they worked side by side, George noticed how Tyler had inherited his methodical approach, carefully measuring ingredients and following instructions with precision. The teenager, who usually communicated in grunts and single-word answers, gradually opened up, sharing stories about his baseball team's chances at the state championship and his struggles with geometry. "You know what's weird, Dad?" Tyler said, as they waited for the quinoa to simmer. "Since we started eating different, I actually feel better at practice. Coach even said my swing looks more powerful." George felt a complicated mix of emotions: pride in his son's observations, guilt that his own poor habits had influenced the entire family, and determination to continue this new path. "Our bodies are like buildings, Ty. They respond to the quality of materials we put into them." Later that evening, George laced up the expensive running shoes that had sat unused in his closet for years and headed out for his daily walk. What had started as a painful 5-minute shuffle around the block had gradually extended to a brisk 30-minute journey through their neighborhood. As he walked past manicured lawns and colonial-style homes, George's mind drifted to his upcoming checkup. He was doing everything right, following the meal plans, attending cardiac rehab 3 times a week, taking his medications religiously, but the fear of permanent damage haunted him. What if it was too late? What if all these efforts were merely postponing the inevitable? His route took him past Marino's, the family-owned Italian restaurant where the Matthews had celebrated countless birthdays and anniversaries. Through the window, George could see families gathered around steaming plates of pasta, sharing bread and laughter. His mouth watered at the memory of their famous chicken parmesan, the comfort of rich, cheesy layers that had once been his go-to order. For a moment he slowed his pace, the pull of old habits strong and seductive. Just one meal wouldn't erase all his progress. He could get back on track tomorrow. The justifications flooded his mind with alarming ease. George's phone buzzed in his pocket, a text from Sarah. "Emma made a heart-healthy apple crisp for dessert. Hurry home before Tyler and I devour it all." The simple message was enough to break the spell. George continued walking, picking up his pace. The truth was, food had never been just food for him. It had been comfort, celebration, distraction, and punishment. Learning to separate emotional needs from physical hunger was proving to be his greatest challenge. At the cardiac rehab center the following day, George found himself on a recumbent bike next to Harriet, a 76-year-old recovering from valve replacement surgery. Despite their age difference, they had formed an unlikely friendship, pushing each other through the grueling sessions. "You're looking troubled today, George," Harriet observed as they pedaled side by side. "Hit a plateau?" George wiped sweat from his brow with a towel. "Not physically. The scale's still moving in the right direction. It's more, I don't know if I can sustain this. Yesterday I almost broke down and ordered a mountain of pasta." Harriet's laugh was unexpectedly robust for someone her size. "Oh, honey, that never goes away completely. I still dream about my late husband's fried chicken, and it's been 30 years since I gave it up." Her eyes twinkled with mischief. "But here's what no one tells you. Eventually, your taste buds change. Your body starts craving the good stuff. It just takes time." "How much time?" George asked, increasing his resistance level as the program dictated. "Longer than you want, shorter than you fear," Harriet replied cryptically. "But I'll tell you something my doctor told me that changed everything. Your worst day on the program is still better than your best day off it." As George drove home, Harriet's words echoed in his mind. He thought about the small victories of the past weeks, being able to bend over and tie his shoes without getting winded, needing to punch a new hole in his belt to accommodate his shrinking waistline, the way Sarah had begun touching him casually again, a hand on his shoulder, fingers brushing his as they passed in the hallway. That night, as he stood on the bathroom scale, 42 pounds still separating him from a healthy weight, George realized something fundamental was shifting within him. This journey had begun as a desperate attempt to avoid death, but somewhere along the way it had transformed into a conscious choice to truly live. Chapter 3. 3 months into his lifestyle overhaul, George sat in a booth at Denny's across from his brother Mike, watching with a mixture of discomfort and envy as Mike demolished a grand slam breakfast. The aroma of bacon and pancakes saturated the air, a sensory reminder of Sunday mornings throughout George's childhood in their working-class neighborhood in northeast Philadelphia. "You sure you don't want some?" Mike asked, gesturing to his plate with a fork laden with syrup-soaked pancake. "You look like you could use a decent meal. Sarah feeding you at all?" His tone was joking, but there was an undercurrent of genuine concern. George sipped his black coffee and glanced down at his own order, an egg white omelette with spinach and a side of fresh fruit that the waitress had needed to check with the kitchen about before confirming they could prepare it. "I'm good with this, Mike." "Really?" Mike shook his head, his expression a mixture of admiration and incomprehension. 43 pounds, huh? That's something. But man, life's too short to eat like a rabbit." The irony of his brother's statement wasn't lost on George. "Actually, life was getting too short because I wasn't eating like a rabbit," he replied, more sharply than he'd intended. A flash of hurt crossed Mike's face. The Matthews brothers had always been close, despite their different paths. George pursuing higher education and moving to the suburbs, Mike taking over their father's plumbing business and remaining in the old neighborhood. Food had always been their common language, a way to bridge their increasingly different worlds. "I'm sorry," George said, softening his tone. "It's just, this isn't a diet, Mike, it's life or death for me." Mike set down his fork, his appetite seemingly diminished. "I get it. I do. It's just weird seeing you like this. You were always the big brother, you know, in every way." He patted his own substantial midsection. "Makes me wonder if I should be worried too." The conversation shifted to something deeper than food, the legacy of their parents' relationship with food during tough economic times, how abundance had been equated with security, how their mother had expressed love through increasingly large portions. For the first time, George articulated how his architectural success had paralleled his physical decline, how client dinners and stress-fueled late nights had gradually reshaped both his body and his relationship with his family. As they parted in the parking lot, Mike pulled George into a bear hug. "I'm proud of you, Georgie. Dad would be too." Their father, who had died of a heart attack at 58 while changing a water heater in a client's basement, had cast a long shadow over both their lives. The mention of their father stayed with George as he drove to his afternoon appointment with Dr. Winters. Traffic crawled along I-76, giving him ample time to reflect on the genetic component of his condition. Had his fate been sealed before he'd taken his first bite of fast food? Was he fighting against his very DNA? In the examination room, George removed his shirt, revealing a body in transition, still heavy but noticeably changed, with loose skin beginning to appear around his midsection as evidence of his progress. Dr. Winters entered with his file, her expression unreadable as she began the examination. She listened to his heart, checked his blood pressure, reviewed the lab results from his most recent blood work. "Your numbers are improving significantly," she finally said, removing her stethoscope. "LDL cholesterol down 35%, blood pressure within normal range, inflammatory markers decreasing. How are you feeling?" "Better," George replied, realizing as he said it just how inadequate the word was to describe the transformation he was experiencing. "I can walk 2 miles now without stopping. I'm sleeping better. The brain fog I didn't even know I had is lifting." Dr. Winters nodded, making notes in his chart. "And the emotional aspects? Any challenges there?" The question caught George off guard. Medical appointments had always been transactional for him. Report symptoms, receive treatment, leave as quickly as possible. No doctor had ever asked about his emotional state before. "It's complicated," he admitted. "Some days I feel incredible, like I've discovered a secret everyone should know about. Other days, it's a struggle not to fall back into old patterns, especially when work gets stressful or the kids are driving me crazy." Dr. Winters set down her clipboard, giving him her full attention. That's completely normal, George. What you're doing, it's not just a physical change. You're rewiring neural pathways that have been reinforced for decades. Your brain is literally being reshaped along with your body. There was something validating about having his internal struggle acknowledged by science. So it does get easier. The research says yes. Habits typically take anywhere from 66 to 254 days to become automatic, depending on the complexity of the behavior. You're right in the middle of that window. She smiled. But I'll be honest, there will always be challenging moments. The difference is, over time, you develop better tools to handle them. As George drove home, he pondered Dr. Winters' words about neural pathways. His mind drifted to a church renovation project his firm had completed the previous year. How they'd discovered that the building's foundation had been slowly compromised by decades of water damage, requiring extensive work before any visible improvements could begin. Perhaps his body was undergoing a similar process, repairing fundamental damage before the outward transformation could fully manifest. At home, George found Sarah in the backyard, tending to her vegetable garden, a project she'd started shortly after his diagnosis. The afternoon sun highlighted the silver strands in her dark hair as she knelt among the raised beds, harvesting late summer tomatoes. "Doctor, Winters says I'm making good progress," he announced, squatting down beside her with an ease that would have been impossible 4 months ago. Sarah looked up, shielding her eyes from the sun. "That's wonderful, George." Her smile was genuine, but there was a guardedness in her eyes that George had noticed more frequently lately. "What is it?" he asked, helping her gather tomatoes into a wicker basket. Sarah sighed, sitting back on her heels. "I'm proud of you, beyond proud. But sometimes I wonder what? If all this change is just about your health, or if there's more." She met his gaze directly. "We've been different since your diagnosis, better in some ways. You're more present, more engaged with me and the kids. But I can't help wondering if it's sustainable, or if once the health crisis passes, we'll slide back into our old patterns." Her honesty hit George like a physical blow. He'd been so focused on the tangible metrics of his transformation, pounds lost, miles walked, cholesterol points reduced, that he hadn't fully acknowledged how his journey was affecting the emotional ecosystem of his marriage. "It's not just about avoiding a heart attack," he said slowly, realizing the truth of his words as he spoke them. "It's about reclaiming everything I was letting slip away, including us." He reached for her hand, soil-streaked and warm from the sun. "I don't want to go back to who I was, Sarah, not any part of it." That evening, as the family gathered around the dining table, a nightly ritual they had reinstated as part of George's recovery plan, Emma announced she had nominated George for her school's Inspiration Spotlight series, a monthly feature highlighting community members who had overcome significant challenges. "They want to interview you next week, Dad," she said, her expression a mixture of pride and uncertainty. "Is that okay? I should have asked first, but Miss Reynolds was really impressed when I told her about your journey." George felt a surge of panic at the thought of publicly discussing his transformation. "I don't know, Em. I'm not sure I'm really spotlight material. I'm still in the middle of this, not at some triumphant conclusion." "That's exactly why they want you," Emma insisted. "Ms. Reynolds says too many stories only show the before and after, not the messy middle where the real work happens." Tyler, who had been quietly eating his grilled chicken and roasted vegetables, looked up. "You should do it, Dad. There are probably other kids whose parents are like how you used to be. Maybe it would help them." The simple observation from his son, delivered without drama or emphasis, crystallized something for George. His journey wasn't just a private battle for health. It was potentially a blueprint for others facing similar struggles. The architect in him recognized the power of a well-documented process, how transparency about both successes and setbacks could inform those who followed. "Okay," he agreed, surprising himself. "I'll do it." Later that night, unable to sleep, George slipped out of bed and made his way to the Home Office. From the bottom drawer of his desk, he retrieved a leather-bound journal Sarah had given him at the start of his journey. A gift he had initially dismissed as unnecessary sentimentality. Opening to a blank page, he began to write, documenting not just the physical milestones, but the emotional terrain he was traversing. As the words flowed, George realized he was drafting not just a record, but a map, one that might someday guide his children through their own inevitable struggles, a legacy more valuable than any building he had ever designed. Chapter 4. 9 months after his diagnosis, George stood at the starting line of the Philadelphia Heart Association's 5K run-walk, surrounded by a sea of red T-shirts emblazoned with Heart Warriors. The autumn air was crisp, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and possibility. At 218 pounds, 68 pounds lighter than when his journey began, George adjusted his race number, still hardly believing he was actually participating in an athletic event. "Nervous?" Sarah asked, securing her own number to her shirt. The entire Matthews family had registered, along with a surprising number of George's colleagues and clients who had been inspired by his transformation, which had become something of a legend at his architectural firm. "Terrified," George admitted with a laugh that came easily now, but the good kind of terrified, like before a big presentation. "You've got this, Dad," Emma said, snapping a pre-race selfie with the family. "Just remember what Coach Phillips told you. Steady pace, focus on your breathing, and enjoy the experience." Coach Phillips, a cardiac rehabilitation specialist who had become an unexpected mentor in George's journey, appeared through the crowd. At 65, with the lean physique of a lifelong runner, Phillips had pushed George beyond what he thought possible while teaching him to respect his body's signals. "Perfect conditions today," Phillips noted, joining their circle. "How's the knee feeling?" George rotated his right leg, testing the joint that had protested when he'd transitioned from walking to jogging. "Much better since I got the proper shoes." "Remember, today isn't about time," Phillips reminded him. "It's a celebration of how far you've come. Walk when you need to, run when you can." As the starting horn blared and the crowd surged forward, George felt a moment of panic. What if he couldn't finish? What if his body, despite all the progress, betrayed him in front of everyone who had come to support him? Sarah squeezed his hand before releasing it. "See you at the finish line," she said, with a confidence that steadied him. The first mile passed in a blur of adrenaline and determination. George settled into the rhythm of his footfalls, consciously implementing the techniques he'd practiced for months. Around him, other participants created a tapestry of human determination. Elderly couples holding hands as they walked, young athletes sprinting ahead, parents pushing strollers, and people of all shapes and sizes moving forward with purpose. Near the halfway point, George spotted a familiar figure struggling up a small incline, Dave Simmons, the client he'd encountered at Whole Foods months ago. Dave had reached out after their chance meeting, confessing his own health concerns and asking for guidance. Now here he was, 30 pounds lighter himself, face flushed with effort but moving steadily forward. George slowed his pace to run alongside Dave. "Looking good, man," he encouraged, noting how Dave's formerly ruddy complexion had cleared, matching the physical transformation evident in his looser clothing. "Didn't think it would be this hard," Dave panted, determination etched in the lines of his face. "Neither did I," George replied honestly. "Every day for the first 3 months, I wanted to quit. Sometimes I still do." They continued in companionable silence for several minutes, the shared effort creating a bond that transcended words. As they approached a water station, George realized something profound. His journey had expanded beyond his immediate family to create ripples in his broader community. Dave was just one of several people who had been motivated by George's example to make their own changes. The final stretch of the race took participants past Independence Hall, a building that had always fascinated George with its architectural significance and symbolic weight. Today, it seemed to represent something personal, his own declaration of independence from the habits and mindsets that had nearly cost him his life. With the finish line in sight, George felt a surge of emotion that threatened to overwhelm him. He thought of his father, who had never reached the age George was now, of Mike, who had recently scheduled his first checkup in years, of Tyler and Emma, who would grow up with a different relationship to food and health than he had, and of Sarah, whose unwavering support had been the foundation of his transformation. As he crossed the finish line, the announcer called out his name, adding, 68 pounds lighter and a heart disease fighter. The cheers from the small crowd of supporters momentarily embarrassed George, who had never sought the spotlight. But as his family engulfed him in a group hug, Tyler's gangly teenage arms, Emma's enthusiastic squeeze, Sarah's steady embrace, he allowed himself to fully inhabit the moment of triumph. Later that afternoon, as the family celebrated with a heart-healthy picnic in Fairmount Park, Dr. Winters made a surprise appearance, joining them on the checkered blanket spread beneath a maple tree ablaze with autumn colors. "I hope you don't mind," she said, accepting a plate of grilled vegetable skewers from Sarah. "I saw the race results posted online and wanted to congratulate my star patient in person." "We're glad you came," Sarah said warmly. "You're part of this success story too." Dr. Winters turned to George. "I brought something for you." She handed him a manila envelope, similar to the one that had contained his diagnosis 9 months earlier. "Your latest test results. I thought you might want to see them today, of all days." With slightly trembling hands, George opened the envelope and scanned the medical report, his eyes widening as he absorbed the information. "Is this accurate?" he asked, hardly daring to believe what he was reading. "Doctor." Winters nodded, her professional demeanor momentarily softening. "Complete reversal of arterial plaque buildup, blood work within optimal ranges across the board. Heart function tests showing normalization of previously concerning indicators." She smiled. "In medical terms, you've reversed your heart disease, George, not just managed it, reversed it." The words hung in the crisp autumn air, their significance sinking in gradually. Emma was the first to react, throwing her arms around George's neck with a squeal of delight. Tyler followed with an uncharacteristic display of emotion, his voice cracking as he said, "Way to go, Dad." Sarah simply gripped George's hand, tears streaming silently down her cheeks. As the initial wave of celebration subsided, Dr. Winters adopted a more serious tone. "This is a tremendous achievement, George, but I want to be clear. Maintenance is now your lifelong commitment. There's no finish line in this race." George nodded, understanding the weight of her words. "I know, and honestly, I wouldn't want to go back, even if I could. This isn't just about my heart anymore." After Dr. Winters departed, the family lingered in the park as afternoon eased into evening. The conversation flowed naturally from topic to topic: Emma's college applications, Tyler's baseball scholarship prospects, Sarah's consideration of a master's program she'd deferred years ago to support George's career. As dusk descended, George found himself sitting slightly apart from the others, watching as Sarah and the kids packed up the remains of their picnic. The simple domestic scene, so ordinary yet so precious, brought a lump to his throat. Sarah joined him on the bench, leaning her head against his shoulder in a gesture that had become increasingly natural again. "Penny for your thoughts," she said softly. "I was just thinking about the architecture of life," George replied. "How we design our days, our habits, our relationships. For years I was creating a structure that was fundamentally unsound. Beautiful facade, maybe, but crumbling foundation." Sarah nodded against his shoulder. "And now? Now, I understand that maintenance isn't boring, it's essential. That the daily choices matter more than the grand gestures." He turned to face her. That losing 68 pounds was never really about the weight at all. As they walked back to the car together, the first stars appearing in the darkening sky, George reflected on the dual nature of his journey, both an ending and a beginning. The acute crisis had passed, But the real work of living would continue every day for the rest of his life. It was a prospect that once would have seemed daunting, even depressing. Now, it felt like the most precious gift imaginable. Not just more time, but more life, more connection, more purpose. Tyler called from ahead, asking if they could stop for frozen yogurt on the way home, a new family tradition that had replaced their former ice cream indulgences. As George quickened his pace to catch up with his son, he felt the steady, strong beat of his healed heart, a rhythm of resilience, a cadence of second chances, the soundtrack of a life reclaimed one conscious choice at a time.